friends, loved ones. Welcome to those that are joining us online for the forum meeting. It's going to be another fantastic year. So let's get stuck in. Apologies for absence, substitution. So I have received apologies from Chris Richards, Jamie Malloy, David Bone, Eman Basu Roy, John Bailey, Rasheen Walsh, and Tony George. There is a substitution. We welcome Councillor Ball in place of Councillor Oxley this evening. Welcome to the forum, sir. And Councillor Sharma is joining us online. And I'm going to welcome at this stage, although we could do it in our membership, I'm going to do it now. I'm going to welcome Alexandra Dioshan, who is joining us as part of the PVI nursery provider position. So welcome to the Schools Forum, and we look forward to your contributions. Declarations of interest. Any changes in the declarations from anyone? No? Okay, so let's jump right into the minutes from the previous meeting. I'm going to go through them page by page as they're listed in the agenda. So I will label the page. If you have anything that you believe needs attention or correction, please do say so. Page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, and page 9.
Just one tiny thing on page 9. It says the meeting commenced at 6 o'clock and finished at 5:52, which it obviously didn't.
I spotted that too, yes.
So it finished at 7:52.
Thank you.
Minus
Tim
8 minutes. Good going.
Yes, so we'll change that to 7:52 p.m. as the meeting finish time. And any other corrections or amendments that anybody believes need to be made? No. I will make a note on this and I will sign these minutes as amended. And we can move on to the next bit, which is around membership. So what we need to note around membership, which we discussed briefly at the last meeting, is that obviously we have a number of primary and special school vacancies that are coming up between now and our next meeting. The membership election will commence tomorrow for primary and special school members. So if your term is coming to an end, we would hope that you would put yourself forward again. And if you are unable or you're unwilling, that's obviously not a problem. But if you could just let us know if you're not intending to reapply, that would be helpful. And if we know of colleagues who have expressed an interest historically in being part of the Schools Forum, this is a great opportunity in the next couple of weeks to give them a nudge, because the election will open tomorrow, but it will close on the 9th of February at 10 a.m. So it is a short window of time for people to be nominated and to put their hat in the ring to be part of the Schools Forum. I know we also discussed last time we have some academy vacancies as well, but we're going to push pause on that while a large number of schools within the local authority are going through the academization process in order for them to be included in that election period. Is there anything about membership that you believe I've missed, officers? Or Sean? No? Okay. So then that takes us straight into the main concept of the meeting. So I'm going to hand over to Kim Price.
Hi everyone. Okay, so the January meeting of the forum covers the following things. So we'll advise the Schools Forum of the early years schools, high needs and central schools services blocks for the 26-27 financial year. Consults Forum on the early years funding formula and seeks approval for the early years centrally retained funding. Advises the Schools Forum on the proposed schools block formula and indicative allocations. And seeks approval from the forum for the allocation of the remaining centrally retained funding following confirmation of the Central School Services block allocation. So starting with the early years block, the recommendations around the early years block are to note the early years consultation feedback, agree the centrally retained level of the early years block at 3%, and to note and comment on the proposed use of the early years block and the proposed rates and structure of the formula. So the early years section starts on page 15 of the report. Helen, I'm going to hand over to you to run through that section.
Apologies. In December, the government published the Authorities 26-27 Dedicated Schools Grant, which you'll be aware consists of the 4 blocks. So the schools, early years, high needs and the central school services. With the support of the Schools Forum at its meeting on the 20th of November, the local authority will retain elements of the central funding and move resources 0.5% off from the schools block to the high needs block in 2026-27. So the early years block element within the dedicated schools grant funds the universal and extended provisions for 3 and 4-year-old children, the early years provision for 2-year-old children from families receiving additional support, and the working parent provision for eligible children aged from 9 months. Funding is also currently used to support children with emerging levels of special educational needs to meet the council's statutory duty in this area. So the key points that relate to the updated funding guidance is summarised here in the report. So confirmation of the increased minimum pass-through requirement for local authorities in 26-27, which was increased from 96% to 97%. Confirmation that the 28th of February deadline by which local authorities must announce their funding rates to childcare providers is now a statutory requirement, and information on how the DfE will be allocating funding to local authorities when they move to a termly funding system for all the early years funding streams from financial year 2026-27. The DfE set out in the Best Start in Life publication in July 25 that they will be reviewing early years funding arrangements and will consult on these changes in the summer of 26. So for funding provided through the 25-26 early years national insurance contributions and teachers pay grant has been rolled into the funding rate for 3 and 4-year-olds, 2-year-olds and 9 months to 2-year-olds for 2026-27. Local authorities and providers will not therefore receive a separate EY and TPC allocation from 26-27. So from financial, apologies.
Can I just, I've been asked to make a comment about this for it to be minuted. So while we appreciate the extra percentage pass through, this roll up of the NI contributions and the teachers pay grant, depending on what the pay awards are, may or may not suck up that extra percentage. I think that's the first thing. But more importantly, and I'm glad that Stefan's here for this, we understand from some recent HR meetings that the trade unions are trying to negotiate a 10% pay rise for support staff. Now, in a maintained nursery school, we have a greater majority of support staff. So all of our nursery practitioners are support staff, not teaching staff. So in this current year, we didn't receive any grant funding for the pay awards, and South Acton, for example, had to find an extra £50,000 out of its existing budget for those support staff. So while it looks like good news in terms of an increased percentage, actually, potentially, our costs are going to be even higher. So I just wanted to flag that as a thing, because in a maintained nursery school, our USP is that to maintain our great ratios, we tend to have a lot more support staff in the classroom.
Okay. Just as a point of clarification, let's make sure that we put questions to the chair, and it's typical that we would let the officer finish their report before we ask a question. But in light of the fact that we've gone down this path, it's absolutely fine. Helen, did you want to take an opportunity to respond to that? And then Stefan, did you want to comment as well? Okay. Helen, did you want to respond to Louise? Or tomorrow,
Yeah,
sorry.
I think we recognise that that's a challenge for all providers, and there are some additional challenges for the maintained sector where the pay of certain types of staff is linked to national arrangements and pay negotiations. At a local level, that's challenging to respond to in advance of those decisions being made. Where there's a national pay policy decision, the government would take a view as to what they may or may not fund, and that is part of the reason there are a hodgepodge of pay pension type grants that are subsequently rolled up. So I think thank you for raising that, and it's important that we do recognise that that's a challenge, but I think at this stage that's not something at a local level that we will be able to take a different approach around at this. Yeah.
Thanks, Tamara. Louise, I think it's a great point, isn't it, about not only private providers, but maintained schools and the chaos that causes for all of us. While we all support everyone earning as much as as they can in a human service, it is very challenging for us, isn't it? Stefan, did you want to reply to the comment? Stefan, I'm not sure your mic is on.
Not getting anything through.
Yeah, I think yours is broken. There we go.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I think you're talking about Unison and GMB. One important sentence is that support staff are very badly paid and desperately need it. All I can say from the NEU and all the national disputes we've had over funding, we've never settled unless it's fully funded, or unless the NHT say it's fully funded. So we don't settle a dispute unless it's fully funded to avoid the fear that you've got.
And I think just important to recognise that bit that Helen was just describing was the wrapping in of the 25-26 grants, which reflect pay awards that have already happened. The additional funding for the 26 that's sort of assumed at the moment for the 26-27 pay awards is within the increases in the rates. If those increases are substantially more than the government are currently assuming end up being, then based on what we've seen over the past few years, we would anticipate that there may be some additional grant funding to reflect that if they are considerably higher. But as I say, that at this stage, the rates are based on the government's current assumptions around those pay awards and what's affordable or not within the formula.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Helen, did you want to continue with your report? Thank you.
So picking up from point 6, so from financial year 26-27, the DfE will be introducing termly funding system to fund all early years entitlements on a termly census headcount. To support local authorities to plan for their budgets for 26-27, adjustments have been made to the 3 and 4-year-old funding rates and how they are determined. Local authorities' indicative allocations for the established entitlements, so the funding for the 3 and 4-year-olds and families of 2-year-olds receiving additional support. This will not impact the way providers are funded, which will continue to be based on the monthly headcounts. So local authorities consulted with schools and early year providers during November and December of 25. So the purpose of the consultation was to seek their views, comments and, where applicable, preferred options for arrangements of the early years funding block for 26-27. So the consultations sought views on comments on the proposal to retain 3% for central services. This is the maximum which is allowed and has been reduced from 4% from 2025 to 26. The proposal to allocate a similar amount of funding for early years SEN inclusion fund is allocated in 25-26. And the proposal to allocate 6% to both the deprivation supplement and the quality supplement for children accessing the 3 and 4-year-old universal funding offers. So this represents a maximum allowance of 12% that can be allocated to supplements. So the proposals continue with the deprivation supplement for the 2-year-old funding offer for families in receipt of additional support. So these were the principals that were consulted on. So there were 3 consultation events held with 25 attendees and 17 providers responded to the consultation. These 5 responses were from primary schools with nurseries. 1 response was from a maintained nursery and 11 responses were from private, voluntary and independent providers. So the responses are summarised further down in below in the relevant sections of this report we go through. So you'll see for proposed funding formula for 26 in table 1, which is set out, outlines the proposed allocation for early years block 26-27, and there's a comparison there to 25-26 position at budget setting. So the final grant value will be determined based on pupil numbers at the summer of 26, autumn 26 and spring 27 census. So for the table, you can see the figures there for central spend allowance, 25-26, 1.997, 26-27, 1.72. Early years SEN inclusion 2.93 to 293. So the figures staying the same. All entitlements for 3 and 4, 2-year-old and under 2-year-olds. For 43.35, 26-27 to 51.43. The contingency to remain the same for 26-27 as in the previous year, and early years pupil premium disability access funding maintain nursery supplements 1.9 to 163. So Ealing recognises the current difficult climate for many early years providers have faced and the importance of continuing to offer a stable funding rates and continue with high levels of inclusion support at a time that has been most testing for provisions, ensuring a fair and equitable offer which meets the needs of Ealing's children. In order to continue with this, the local authority proposes funding rates for 26-27 at the level set out in table 2 below. So the increase includes the impact of wrapping in the EYNTPG grant funding and adjustments made to account for anticipated impact of the move to termly headcounts on overall funding.
Helen, before we move on to supplementary funding, do we want to open up for any questions? Is that all right? Any question or comment on the report so far? Ian?
Sorry, there was reference to changing the way the funding comes through to termly. I don't know whether that makes any impact or has any impact on the way that the settings actually cope. I don't know how they receive their money at the moment. Is it?
So there's that's referencing the change to how the funding comes through to the local authority. So the funding to providers has for some years now been paid out on a monthly basis based on monthly headcounts, and that's not changing. What is changing is that the government used to use the January census to fund the early years block, and now they're moving to using the 3 termly. They're collecting the information and using the 3 termly censuses. So the money that comes into the local authorities is more kind of reflective of the ebbs and flows through the year in terms of those head counts. There are some implications from that. So averaging out at January actually is slightly higher than for most authorities than doing autumn, spring and summer separately. But what's happened in the amounts of funding is that's been reflected in the amounts of those increases that we've seen to the early years block rates for this year.
Thanks, Kim. Louise?
Yeah, our view is that it's welcomed, that it's more reflective and real time of what's actually happening in the setting. So we're happy with that. Because sometimes we can have a really bad January. So yeah, but it's welcome certainly by the settings that I've spoken to. I just wanted to make another point that I've also been asked to make, which is about the fact that an element of the funding is supposed to include rates, so our standard rates. So maintained nursery schools don't get the reduced rates that schools do, and I've been asked to ask why that is different, and because we don't believe that funding reflects increased costs for rates. So for both the nursery schools in our federation, the rates alone are 30,000 per annum. So we just wondered why it's different for schools and maintained nursery schools. And I don't expect an answer today if there isn't one, but I've been asked to note it in the minutes.
Tomorrow?
Yeah, so there is variability across setting types and the types of additional funding that settings will receive for a variety of factors. And so schools do pay rates, and there are different funding elements as part of their wider school block that supports the funding of those. PVI sector settings pay rates, and so do standalone maintained nursery schools. So there's no difference in that rates are payable by all settings. And for PVI settings, they will be paying rates as well. That's a national situation. It's not a determination that Ealing has made, and so it's a natural consequence of there being variability in the types of settings, the types of funding arrangements, and national arrangements around rate setting. And so that's not determined by the early years services. That will be determined nationally and implemented locally. But again, it's an important point and a factor that will create some challenges for some settings.
I think so, because the difference between a PVI and a maintained nursery school is that a PVI is generally for profit, whereas a maintained nursery school is not. So I think, again, it's a big element of our budget that we have to consider. So
I mean, I think it's important to note that at the moment, maintained nurseries schools do receive additional supplementary funding. So there's a maintained nursery supplement, which is passed directly through to maintained nurseries at the rate we receive that from the government. And that is partly to reflect some of those additional costs that maintained nurseries face compared to other parts of the sector. So that is continuing in the funding arrangements for 26-27.
Thanks, Kim. Any other questions on the early years block or proposed early years funding formula factors? John?
Yes, I was just wondering, could officers explain the rationale for the special educational needs inclusion funding staying at the same level when we seem to have an increase in need coming up at the moment?
Aretha? It's too short, Stefan.
Thank you. So yeah, so we've looked at it, and actually the needs, although it's increasing, we think that will cover the need increase when we've looked at what's coming through the system. We have reviewed a lot of our mechanisms in terms of how people access that. So we've got new panels in place, we've got new data dashboards, and we've got a completely new application form, because we recognise that one of the barriers to actually applying for SENIF is the length of the form. So that has all been bottomed out. What we will want to do is move to the next phase, which is to look at the banding alongside actually how much people actually get for SENIF, because we do recognise that actually the need is increasing. We need to make sure that the schools, the nurseries and the providers actually get funding to match the pupil needs. So we will look at different mechanisms and consulting on that. But as it stands, when we've looked at the data and we've looked at the use over the last couple of years, actually that's about right for now. Not to say that it won't increase at a later point, if once we've got the data and the evidence to back it up, and maybe people start to apply for SENIF in more detail. It also pays for special provision and specialist nursery provision, and that's pretty much the same as it was before. We haven't changed or increased that provision.
Okay.
John?
Thanks, that's really useful, so we can have further discussions about the 27-28 financial year coming up.
Yeah, I think we will need to, because we do want to make the mechanism of actually applying it and to enable providers to actually look at the budget and be able to kind of
gauge what they will be getting over the course of the year based on the children's needs. At the moment, it's quite difficult to do that, and so we want to make it more transparent for providers so they can start to actually apply for it, but also manage their budgets more effectively.
And to clarify, so the inclusion fund is part of the pass through to providers. So there's a balance in terms of how much is held in the inclusion fund and how much is passed through the rates for early years. Through the consultation responses, the providers that responded, not noting that it's a relatively low response rate, but were broadly in favour of keeping that at the same value as last year, rather than ramping that up and increasing it in line with the increase of the block, which is obviously increased considerably with the rollout of the wider entitlements. A lot of those wider entitlement rollouts were around the working parent elements of it. So the large increase in the block was to do with some sort of aspects of provision. And so I think at the moment we feel that the 2.93 million remains kind of reflective of the level of need, but we'll continue to review that ahead of next year.
Thanks, Kim. Tamara, did you want to come in?
Yeah, and I think in line with the work that Aretha and the team have done to strengthen our understanding of need and improve the approach to accessing the funding, we are waiting for a white paper to be published, and there's a level of uncertainty around what that might mean for the offer that needs to be developed in the area, how that will be funded, the impact on providers. And so in the absence of that clarity, I think it would be difficult to develop a case to do something materially different to what we've done to date and the improvements that have already been made. So absolutely 27-28 and the lead up for that and the work that will be required over the course of the summer and autumn terms will be important to determine the value of the inclusion fund going forward.
Thank you, Tamara. Councillor Ball.
Thanks, and yeah, apologies for all this coughing. It's my asthma playing up. It's not anything infectious, just to reassure everyone. So I just wanted to clarify on this point. Although the overall SEND expenditure is going up, are you saying that the specific items that are covered by the SEND inclusion funding, you think they can be covered from the same amount? Is that what you're saying, or are you saying that because there's other funding coming from other directions, there isn't a need to increase this particular pot, sort of thing?
Aretha, Tamara, Kim.
First one. So we believe that it will hold at the current levels at the moment. So there isn't anything that we should be doing differently, which is why we've kept the values the same. Not to say that with the reforms and everything else, the parameters might change as we go through the systems that we've put in place. Maybe we'll see an increase in spend in that way because we'd be promoting it a lot more. But as it stands, based on the data that we've got at the moment, that seems to be the right figure.
Alexandra.
Sorry, just to emphasize, from my understanding, the SENIF applications will become easier to manage. That's great news.
Yeah, so they'll be online through Gateway. We're just waiting for IT to get that sorted, but we've done a whole new form which enables, which is shorter, essentially. It was a lot of paperwork and a lot of evidence that you needed to provide, and we've cut all of that back.
That's great news. Thank you.
So I'd be interested in your feedback once you've used it.
Thank you. Louise?
One last comment in relation to the not increasing the SEN inclusion fund. We've got a waiting list for our SEN provision. We're turning children away regularly. So it doesn't feel like the need is met currently with current funding.
Thank you. Aretha?
Yeah, we can pick up a conversation about the waiting list and everything else, but when you look at the amount of nurseries that we've got that cope with specialist provision actually and where they are, it's the same conversation that I've had around the ICANN provision in terms of equity of access. So it might be that we have come to a different decision about how those nurseries are run, where they are and the capacity that they have, but we pick up a conversation about that afterwards. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you. Any further question or comments on this section before we move on to the next? Thank you. Oh, no, we're good. Thank you. Helen, go ahead.
The 2 highlighted. I just wondered why. It's gone off. Okay, so moving on to supplementary funding for 3 and 4 year olds, 2-year-olds. Providers responded positively through the consultation to the proposals regarding supplements, with 88% agreeing that the supplements for 3 and 4-year-olds should be set at the maximum allowable, which is 12%, with 6% for quality and 6% for deprivation. And the local authority should continue with a deprivation supplement to those 2-year-olds that access FRAS funding. Feedback received from one respondent who did not support the proposal stated that they felt that supplements should be kept to a minimum so that the base rate is higher, so the base rate is the highest it can be. So rates set out above represent increases in supplements of 0.17 for quality, 0.40 for deprivation, and for 3 and 4-year-olds, and 0.37 for deprivation for 2-year-old. These increases have been achieved partly due to an increase in the proportion of the funding allocated to supplements to the maximum 12% for 3 and 4-year-olds, and partly due to the change in the way we take up has been factored into the budget setting calculation. So for central expenditure, local authorities are required to, as minimum, pass through 97% of funding to providers in 26-27. This is an increase of 1% from the previous year. This requirement applies separately to each of the entitlements and is in place to ensure that the great majority of government funding reaches providers to enable them to deliver the government's entitlement offer. Under guidance of the National Funding Formula, authorities can retain up to 3% of the funding in 25-26 to support delivery of key services to support early years provisions and services. So the following DSG early years block funding streams are not included in the 97% pass-through calculations and are instead fully passed through to the providers at the allocated rates. And these are the DAF, the Disability Access Fund, the early years pupil premium, maintained nursery supplement. For 26-27, Ealing proposes to continue to retain the maximum allowable of 3% allocation, despite overall increases in the block value following the rollout of the extended entitlements. The reduction in the percentage will reduce the amount of funding retained, and that is set out in the table 3.
Thank you. This is a one for form to agree.
Yeah.
So before we agree or not, are there any comments or questions on the proposed centrally retained budget allocations for the upcoming year? Councillor Bull?
Yeah, so can you clarify, so will these services be cut by that amount, or will there be funding found from somewhere else for them?
So we will be reviewing the services and looking at kind of the resource within the current spaces. We do have some other reforms that are coming down the line which might shape some of our services slightly differently, but we are in the process of reviewing that.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments on this section before we agree or not the proposed centrally retained budget? No? Okay, so we're just going to take a quick, this is a vote for all, which was clarified, I believe. So this is a vote for all 4 members. We're going to just go in a reverse order, in the sense that if you disagree, please let us know now. Otherwise, we will assume you agree unless you are looking to abstain. No disagreement, so we agree. Quorum agrees the centrally retained budget allocations. Thank you. Sorry, Helen, continue.
Fine. So in the report, there is it contains at point 19 the feedback that was gained from the consultation in terms of agreeing 82% of the respondents agreed to the consultation, and feedback received from one respondent did not agree. Mentioned that they felt the local authority should allocate all available funding to the base rate. Moving on to the early years pupil premium and disability access funding. The early years pupil premium gives providers additional funding to support children with families receiving additional support, access and entitlement place. Early years pupil premium funding has increased to 1.15 per hour, an increase of 0.15 per hour compared to 25-26. So all early years providers who provided early years entitlements provisions to children eligible for the EYPP are eligible to receive the EYPP, is only payable for the first 15 hours used by children taking up one or more of the entitlements, and is not payable on additional hours. So for the Disability Access Fund, this is an additional payment made to providers to help to make reasonable adjustments within the provision to support eligible children in receipt of disability living allowance. The DAF is paid as a one-off yearly payment, and the rate has increased to £975 per year from 26-27, an increase of £37 from 25-26 rate. Moving on to contingency, the local authority proposes that in 26-27 the contingency is held at the same level as in 25-26, and a budget of 1.11 mil is set aside to ensure adequate contingency is in place to cope with in-year changes in headcount as the new entitlements embed, and the level of uncertainty around the impact of moving from termly headcounts under the conditions of grant. That is part of the 97 pass-through.
Any questions on the early years pupil premium and the DAF? No. Thank you. Senef?
Thank you. So all local authorities are required to have SEN inclusion funds, SENF, for children who are below school age who have special educational needs. These funds are intended to support local authorities to work with providers to recognise and support the low level of emerging needs of individual children with SEND, and to help providers offer places to these children. Under the conditions of the grant, this is a part of the 97% pass-through. The value of the inclusion fund should consider the number of children with SEND in the local area, the level of need, and the overall capacity of the local childcare market to support these children. In 2026-27, the proposal is to keep SEN inclusion funds, the SENF fund, at the same value as in 2025-26, which is 2.93 mil. Due to the increase of the overall block value, this represents a reduction in the proportion of the early years block from 6.19% to 5.13%. The proposal to continue allocating a similar amount of early years block to the SEND Inclusion Fund was supported by 76% of the respondents to the consultation. Of the respondents that did not support this proposal, one felt the amount should be increased in line with the number of children presenting with SEN, and one stated that they felt the amount should be added to the base rate so that providers can manage this for themselves. Council SEND and AP strategy focuses on early intervention, and as such there are interventions and support activities focusing on early intervention and identification and support for children in early years with SEND, with the aim of improving school readiness and transitions. This work is also outlined in the DSG management plan.
Thanks, Rita. Maybe I jumped the gun on us having a bit of a SENF discussion earlier, but are there any further comment or question on SENF? No, I mean, the only thing I think maybe we note is that there is perhaps a slight chasm between maybe what officers are feeling about the CENIF application and what providers, schools are feeling about the need, the level of need, which is not to say one is right or wrong, but maybe worthy of further conversation in a future meeting in terms of how we're funding this and how much we're funding it. But I think for today, we've had the conversation we need to have. Yes, Louise?
Yeah, I agree. It's probably we need to share more information before we can have a more informed discussion, because I don't understand what data may have been used to come up with the conclusion. But I just know from in real practical terms, we're not usually able to identify a child that we might want to apply for CENIF for until they've been in the setting a good couple of months. So sometimes as a, you know, if there was a census type approach to the data, that might not work, but we can take that offline. But thank you.
Great, thank you. Kim, on to schools block.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so schools block. So the recommendations around this area are noting the value of the schools block and the budgeted commitments, noting and commenting on the indicative allocations and the proposed formula factors, and noting the external growth fund estimates and proposed approach. So running through this, so this section starts on page 19 of the report. So following decisions were made at the November meeting, so agreeing the transfer of 0.5%. So subsequently that's been confirmed as 1.712 million, the value of that, and also the growth fund rules were agreed at that meeting as well. Forum were also consulted on and supportive of continuing to set the minimum funding guarantee at the sort of minimum allowable and keeping the formula as close to the national funding formula as possible. So those things have been kind of factored into the indicative formula setting for 26-27. The minimum funding guarantee protected 3 schools based on that formula, the indicative formula, so to a value of 41,000, so a lower amount than last year. I think it was 250 something last year, and a lower number of schools. So that's partly because there was a higher increase in the formula factors through the formula this year than there was last year. So actually more providers saw their funding increase by, or not fall by, more than 0.5%. It was only a small number that were protected by that this year. Table 4 shows the grant allocations and the based now on the confirmed October pupil numbers, which were a reduction of 1.5% on the October 24 figures, which will prove quite challenging for some schools this year because there are some significant decreases related to those pupil numbers in some schools. Grants been the things that are separate grants this year, so around the national insurance contributions, the school budget support grant, are rolled in to the funding formula for next year, and that's been rolled in to reflect the full year of the pay award for the school budget grant. And so Appendix 1 sets out those indicative allocations at a school level. To be clear on those comparisons with last year, so the figure being compared against for last year is the allocation through the formula plus those grants last year. So what you're seeing in terms of an increase or decrease there is compared to kind of the total quantum of funding for this year, including those grants, to try and give a kind of a more fair comparison and see what the actual increase or decrease compared to what schools have received this year will be. And then the formula factors are set out in Appendix 2, so the proposed formula factors, to remind forum members that these are decisions first. So the formula itself is a decision for the council, so a decision for the cabinet to make. And so we'll go to the 11th of February cabinet meeting for political ratification. But we're not at this stage expecting any significant changes to those indicative rates set out in the appendices. In terms of the affordability of the funding, so there's a lag to the way that the funding is allocated to local authorities to then pass on to schools. That lag that has created an affordability gap this year. So that gap is related to continued increases in free school meals. So effectively the quantum of funding that comes into the local authority is based on free school meal rate. It includes the is based on free school meal rates in October 24, whereas the funding that gets passed out to schools is based on free school meal rates in October 25. And because we've continued to see free school meal rates increase this year, that does lead to a bit of an affordability gap. So other factors are kind of lower than last year, but for the free school meals particularly, that's the big thing that's impacting on the gap. So there was some work done this year. There was a project around auto enrolment to try and identify children who were eligible for free school meals but not claiming. And then there was some work done with schools to make sure that where children have moved schools, schools were aware and recording those children correctly on census. So that means that schools are receiving that additional funding for those children, and those children and those families are receiving the additional benefits of free school meals. So it's a good thing, but because of the nature of the funding formula, it does cause some pressures on the funding formula. So what we discussed at in the November meeting was that our starting point for the formula was to keep the adjustments the same as the previous year. So to roll through the same formula with the same adjustments as the previous year. We've, in addition to doing that, we've needed to make a further small adjustment to the age-weighted pupil unit compared to the values in the national funding formula to manage that affordability gap. So it's a further 0.5% adjustment to the age-weighted pupil unit. So it still represents an increase to the age-weighted pupil unit for schools, but it's a slightly smaller increase than the national funding formula have seen to enable the management of that affordability gap. And the decision to continue with those formula factor adjustments rather than capping or scaling. I think we discussed in quite a lot of detail the sort of thinking around this last year, but effectively it avoids disproportionately impacting those schools who see the highest increase in deprivation and mobility and those with falling roles, because those are the schools that actually see the larger per pupil gains through the national funding formula. And then on point 41, the growth fund allocation was confirmed at 897. So I think in the November meeting, we were estimating it to be around 900,000. So it's similar to what we were estimating that to be. And just to confirm that mostly almost all relates to secondary changes, not to primary changes. And yeah, so the proposal, so we've kind of worked that through the formula, and the proposal is to fully fund the explicit growth. So any bulge class requirements, which are likely to primarily be a secondary thing, although we don't know what might come around the corner. But based on the estimates, proposed to fully fund those through the growth fund allocation, rather than needing to further top slice any of the schools block formula. And in fact, actually, there's some of that, a little bit of that allocation that came through the formula from the government for growth is being used within the formula, so to contribute to meeting the affordability gap and avoid needing to make further adjustments to the formula. So as I say, the comparison with last year and the formula factors set out in Appendix 2, and what that then means for individual schools is set out in Appendix 1. So are there any questions or comments on?
Councillor Moore.
Yeah, just on the reduction in pupil numbers by 1.5%. What's the thinking going forwards? Is it like to continue kind of year on year similar numbers, or is that a 1.5% in a year seems quite an extreme variance? Is that likely to continue along those lines, or is it likely to kind of revert to smaller changes?
We've seen we've seen primary school roles falling for a number of years now, and that is now passing through into secondary. So those smaller cohorts of children are moving through into secondary. So what you're seeing is larger cohorts dropping off the top ends and smaller cohorts coming in the bottom ends, which is having this overall impact. What we're also seeing is fewer in-year in-year admissions. So the in-year admissions has come down. So what you're seeing is children leaving and not being replaced in as high numbers as they're leaving. So that's having a net impact as well on some schools. We're the birth rate, so we're currently in reception at the kind of lowest years in terms of the birth rate. Births have then upticked a little bit since then. Although the years that are joining reception last year and this year are kind of the children that were born during COVID. So actually the relationship between births and roles was a bit disrupted by different things that happened in terms of migration trends and people moving around during COVID. So we are expecting to see we're not necessarily expecting to see big further reductions at primary, maybe see it leveling off a bit more. We are expecting to see some reductions moving through secondary as those kind of larger cohorts drop off the top and smaller cohorts come through into secondary. So yeah, we probably will continue to see that impact. And when you look at the individual impact on individual schools, in some schools that is quite a significant impact. So they're seeing an increase in their per pupil rate, but actually a fairly significant drop off in their total allocation related to the pupil numbers. So it is
Thanks very much.
Thanks. A challenge.
Thank you. Any other question or comment on schools block?
Yeah, I had a couple of things, Jeremy, if I may.
Please.
If you can hear me all right. Kim, the point about the minimum funding guarantee, which is getting smaller, does it continue to keep at a low level and eventually disappear as alignment with the national funding formula eventually makes it irrelevant, or does it always stay and could go back up again? That was point one. And the point you made about free school meals being a sort of year behind, does that eventually unwind and we actually just catch up, but it's delayed because of the lag in the data? Those were the 2 points.
Okay, so on the minimum funding guarantee, the things that impact that are how much cohorts are changing between schools. So often the schools that are being protected are the schools where actually the cohort's getting less deprived, less mobile. So the things that are highly funded through the formula, where that's becoming less of a pressure for that school. It's some of those schools that tend to be protected through the minimum funding guarantee. And the thing that really impacts how many schools end up being protected by it is what level of increase there is to the rates coming through. Because if you've only got a 0.7% increase, like I think it was last year after you accounted for the wrapping in of the grants, because you do get variation in cohorts, you're going to see more schools being protected by it. Whereas actually when you have a slightly higher increase, you'll get less schools protected. So those are the kind of factors that tend to impact it. From a government perspective, we're still moving towards, so they're kind of tightening the rules around the national funding formula with the aim of eventually still getting to a fully hard national funding formula, but it's still some years off. Our funding formula is already like pretty close to the national funding formula.
I seem to remember for the last 5 years we've been talking about how close we were to the national funding formula, and it's still in play a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, so you're always going to get it because of that kind of comparison and the year-on-year comparison with the previous year. So you're always going to, that's what that minimum funding guarantee is trying to mitigate against. So that's the sort of point of having it. In terms of the free school meals and catching up, so it is a lagged fund, so it does catch up because it is a lagged funding methodology. But the challenge that creates the affordability gap is the fact that schools are funded based on October 25's cohorts, but the funding coming into the local authority, while the pupil numbers are adjusted, the formula factor stuff is based on the year before. So it's that difference between those that creates that affordability gap sometimes.
But the thing is, it isn't lost. It does come through. The problem is, while you have continually increasing free school meal numbers, it's always going to be adverse, isn't it, in the short term? Okay, I get that.
I mean, there are some significant changes coming along to free school meals for next year. So transitional protection that's been in place for 8 years is ending, and the free school meals criteria is being extended to all children on universal credit. So there are some changes coming through that. although there'll be a level of protection for school funding because of the fact that the pupil premium is the main thing that's funded, and that is based on eligible in the last 6 years. But there will be some changes to preschool meal eligibility over the next year that could impact what that gap looks like for next year.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Ian. Any other questions? I have a question. Well, I have a two-part question. Maybe the first is, when we look through Appendix 1, I mean, let's say there's approximately 60 primary schools. Of those 60, over 10, 12-ish, are losing six-figure amounts from their budgets due to pupil numbers. Well, predominantly due to pupil numbers. So do we have any mechanisms in place to protect schools? Because a primary school losing a six-figure income makes them exceptionally vulnerable. So do we have anything in the local authority that helps protect those schools? And then the second question is, if we see that as a trend in some schools, what's the local authority's position on determining whether a school is financially viable any longer?
Thanks, Jeremy. So in respect of the protection comes through the lagged nature of the funding. So there's the protection of the count coming down, but the funding then being adjusted the following financial year. That is a timing challenge, and schools' responses to managing within the budget available will vary depending on the local need within the school, improvements and development of the curriculum and a whole variety of things. Schools are struggling to remain sustainable where there are significant fall-offs in funding, and we are seeing deficits in schools which are reported in the summer meeting of the forum, and there is an update that is in the report around that that Kim will come to. More broadly, the local authority has a place planning working group which we have with a range of stakeholders, including the diocese, schools from all sectors and phases, where we discuss the arrangements that support school sustainability, such as partnership arrangements through federations, sharing of resources through SLAs. But there are definitely some challenges, and you will have seen in the summer publication that there were a small number of schools with very large deficits, and those schools are working hard on recovery plans. Part of the protection for schools is around the speed with which there's an expectation that they recover. And so where schools have a large deficit, the expectation is that they stabilise the in-year position, and any focus on repayment of the deficit is managed under a more extended period of recovery for that school. And so the focus then is on stabilising the quality of provision, stabling the financial position, and then a holistic assessment done in partnership between the local authority, the school and the governing body. So it is a challenge, and the protections are limited, and there isn't any alternative funding available that the LA has that they can provide to schools.
Thank you, Tamar. Any other questions? Okay. The next section, sorry.
So running through the reports, and we're on page 22 now. So the different funding elements outside the formula are set out in point 44. In terms of additional grant funding, so as mentioned, the pay award and national insurance contribution funding has been wrapped in for this year. No indication at this stage that there will be any additional grant funding for pay awards in 26-27, but those indications haven't come at this stage in the last few years. They've come once those pay awards have been agreed. So if those pay awards are substantially higher than is currently being muted, it may be that, or is currently being assumed, it may be that there are, but we wouldn't know that at this stage. And the pupil premium rates are increasing by £35 for primary, £25 for secondaries. That's the rates that are set out at the bottom of page 22. Education functions and dedelegation. So those decisions were made and agreed at the November meeting of the forum. So the tables on pages 23 and 24 just set out what the final allocations for those are based on the final pupil numbers, and also what those budgets are excluding the proposed Catholic primary school conversions. So those 8 primary schools are currently working towards an April conversion. So that's with at the moment. Those budgets are based. The middle column is showing what it would be based on all maintained schools, but we're working towards the assumption that those budgets would be adjusted down if those Catholic Academy of conversions have taken place at that stage. For those dedelegation areas and for aspects of the education functions, there will then be a buyback arrangement with those academies in the same way there is with existing academies, rather than it being a top slice through the formula as it is for maintained schools.
Is it possible to maybe, I mean, the way I'm reading it here is that both of these columns, one is assuming they're inside and one is assuming that they leave. Maybe just tagging on to what Councillor Ball asked in a previous table, the same question. If indeed they do academize, obviously there's quite a significant reduction in budget across those sectors. Is this a reorganization? Is it a reallocation? What's the implication for those services if that takes place?
So for the dedelegations, all of those items can then be provided as a traded service to those schools and are already to a large number of the academies. Those services have already sort of begun those conversations, I think, with the trust, and there've been generally sort of positive noises about wanting to continue with those buyback arrangements. I'll let Stefan come in on that in a second. For the education functions, it is slightly different. So there are some elements of that. So, for example, some elements of the core school improvement functions are available as a kind of traded relationship with academies who are accessing those services. Other areas, there will need to be proportionate reductions to manage that reduction in budget.
Okay, thank you. Stefan, do you want to comment?
When we were in disputes and settled with written guarantees from the diocese about terms and conditions, both local and national, one of the things that we continued to push, even though it wasn't on our ballot paper, was that they would continue to buy into Ealing, and I was guaranteed verbally at least that would be at least for 10 years. But now, as you know, it's not going to be an Ealing cat, it's going to be a much bigger cat, and they don't intend to buy into Ealing. Do you have any comments on that?
Mark?
So in short, not at this stage. There are ongoing decisions that will be taking place at diocese level and in consultation with the Department for Education. So we continue to work closely on those arrangements. Irrespective of the broader size and scale of any CAT, there will be services that schools will require, which may or may not be provided by the Central Trust. And so we would be seeking to continue to work with whichever arrangements those schools end up being part of.
Stefan?
I was told that they're going to amalgamise and cut Ealing out. I heard that from the horse's mouth. No, not Ealing, but when it goes from 10 trusts to 4 in about 3 or 4 years' time.
And so at the previous meeting of the forum, we had a broad discussion about some of the potential implications of the Catholic schools transitioning across, and we will be monitoring the situation closely and will need to consider the implications of schools buying in at varying levels, which is a risk anyway, because schools determine their traded services annually. And so, as I said previously, we're continuing to work closely with the interim chief executive of the currently proposed Ealing Trust.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you, Stefan. Obviously, some of these points, while relevant and quite important to many people sitting around the table are not specifically for forum. So I think we park that that conversation as it stands. I mean, there's a level of risk there that I think we're all feeling. It's Mara.
So a slightly separate point to the question around the implication around the deed delegations and some of those traded services, and there are also implications for education functions. Something to consider, which is, you know, these services are primarily costs as primarily staff related. The contingency is not, and so while there may be a perceived reduction in the need for contingency because there will be fewer schools. Linked to the previous conversation we had around schools at risk of being in serious financial difficulty, that is a conversation that we will need to pick up again, most likely in the summer meeting of the schools forum, to consider the arrangements which schools would like to be in place. And so it's not a direct consequence of any decision for those schools to move across, but it kind of exacerbates an existing challenge insofar as the contingency is a very, very small amount, and that doesn't genuinely provide any protection to any one schools or the broader costs associated with exceptional costs that a school might incur, which you might reasonably provide some central funding for. That is the only pot of funding that we have any flexibility around.
Right. I just went from a 7 to a 10, but no. That's very helpful information, and I think for the elements that are appropriate for the schools forum, I think you know, in future meeting we need to probably spend some time on this. But as it stands today, with what we can make decisions on and note, I think we've understood what, you know, what the lay of the land currently is. Do we want to move on now, Kim, to the next section?
Move on to essentially retained. So most of the decision around this was taken at the November meeting. We now know what the increase in the central school services per pupil rate is. So we've seen a 3.5% increase in the per pupil rate, partly related to the fact that an element of that funding is related to deprivation, and we're continuing to see this increase in free school meals. So that has implications for our per pupil rate. So what that means is that the final grant value, excluding the historical commitments bit, which is separate, has now been confirmed at 2.3 million. So it's £44,000 higher than the allocations, the indicative allocations that we agreed at the November meeting. So what we said we would do if that allocation was higher was bring it back to this meeting for agreement around where to allocate that. So the proposal is to allocate that additional funding, 19k of it to education welfare and 25k of it to school admissions. It won't not go the full way, but to partially fund the pay award pressures on those areas. So the indicative allocations we agreed in November were keeping the rates the same as the previous year. Now we know we've got that additional 44,000. That's the proposal in terms of how to allocate it out to those two areas. So the final proposed allocations are set out in table 8 on page 24 and 25. So it's a vote for forum around agreeing that those that we can allocate out those additional amounts.
This is each.
Those two lines. So it's the education welfare line and the school admissions line.
Any question or comments on either of those lines before we take a reverse vote? No?
No.
Anyone opposed to the increase to the education welfare? No. Anyone opposed to the increase to school admissions? No. So forum agrees those.
Okay. Thank you, Jeremy. So moving on to the high needs block section. So the recommendations around the high needs block are to note the value of the high needs block in the budgeted commitments, and to note that officers will report further on both the strategy and the DSG management plan around working to reduce the manage the within the allocation and reduce the deficit at the April meeting. So there's a short section on the high needs block on page 25 to 26. So the key things to note around this, so table 9 sets out the indicative allocation for 26-27. The key thing to note around the high needs block is that while there's an increase of a £5.1 million increase in the block, all that actually is the wrapping in of things that was the amounts that were grant funding last year. So there's a significant amount of funding that was allocated through grants to special schools, and then some funding to resource provisions last year that has now been wrapped into the high needs block. So those won't be separate grants in 26-27. They'll be provided through the high needs block, and then there's a requirement for us effectively to just passport those through to the schools at the rates they were receiving them in 25-26. There isn't any other increase at the moment to the high needs block at all. So over the last 5 years, we've seen increases, some years of kind of 7% or more, some years of kind of 2-3%. This year at the moment, there isn't any other increase. So what the DfE have said they've done effectively is frozen the temporarily suspended the high needs national funding formula, awaiting the SEN reforms. So we've effectively, apart from that adding in of the grants, we've effectively got exactly the same money in the high needs block, despite all the increases in the numbers and the demand as we had in 25-26. Now there's an intention to then, what have they said? The following wider reforms to the SEN system the government will set out in early 26. There will review the methodology for allocating high needs funding so it supports the SEN reforms. So there's clearly some intention that alongside those SEN reforms, there will be some announcements around funding which will be aimed at sort of supporting the aims of the SEN fund reform. So we don't know what that will look like at that stage, whether that will be additional grant funding to some sectors or some targeted funding. But at the moment, there isn't any additional funding through the high needs block, which is going to be extremely challenging position. So Forum agreed to continue the 0.5% transfer at the last meeting, and we reported the projected overspend on the high needs block, which is an in-year projected overspend of 12 million for this year, which would take the overall overspend to 18 million. So further work is going to continuing to reduce that, and we'll report further on that position in the April meeting as part of our kind of more detailed high needs block update at that meeting.
Thanks, Kim. Any questions, comments on the high needs block?
Yes, I do.
Ian?
Again, given that you say that there is no real increase and it's flat year on year, but the demand is increasing, we know that pupil numbers in SEND are increasing. Where is the pain going to fall, would you think, in the interim before they finally come up with a proposal to perhaps fund it a bit more sensibly going forward following their current consultation? Because it's going to happen somewhere. You can't go from one year to the next without additional funding when your pupil numbers are going up. So I was just wondering if we have an answer for that yet.
It's short across the
It's
entire
very
system.
quiet here.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah,
I think
can
there's
now.
going to
Thank
be,
you.
yeah, I think it's going to be distributed across the system. We're not going to know until the SEND reforms come out. So your best bet is maybe contact Secretary of State and ask her.
I'm sure she'll listen to everything I say.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Aretha. Tamara?
Yeah, so in the period between now and whenever the reforms are published, and hopefully an update around the funding arrangements, it's a watch this space position. So in reality, the funding arrangements for individual children, the services and provision that we have, the pressures that we already have on the block, those all remain kind of constant, and the actual pressure is on the cash reserves of the local authority, and so because we will continue to fund schools and we will continue to meet the statutory duties set out in plans, and so we'd hope that that will be resolved relatively quickly to mitigate against those issues and pressures being exacerbated further.
Thanks, Mara. I have lots to say about this, but I'm not going to say anything at all because I think we're all on the same page. Please, Kim.
Okay, so and then the last update forum is just a short update on the implementation of the balance control mechanism and on the forecasted school balances. So on the balance control mechanism at the July meeting, forum asked the local authority to implement the 24-25 balance control mechanism. So following the review of the balance forms and a consideration of representation from school, clawback was taken forward on 2 schools of a very minimal value. So it's I think it was £12,000 in total, the value of that. So, but that was taken forward as confirmed and as agreed at the July meeting. And then in terms of forecasted balances, and Tamara made reference to this earlier, so we asked schools to make a budget monitoring turn at the end of October. So at the end of October, there are 19 schools forecasting they'll be in deficit at the end of this financial year. So 3 high, 12 primary, 2 special and 2 nursery schools. That's an I think that's down to 1 nursery school now. I think one of those has shifted that position since then. But that's an increase from 13 at the end of 24-25. So we are seeing more schools forecasting a deficit. That if that is where that ends up, that will represent a quarter of all maintained schools. I mean, this is a position that other schools, other London boroughs are also seeing. We're sort of working with those schools, and some of those schools are further forward in terms of developing deficit recovery plans. In others, that's still a different work in progress. There are, I mean, of those in deficit at the end of the previous year, 4 schools are forecasting reducing that deficit. So there are some schools who have managed to reduce the deficit position and be back into a sustainable position in year. 8 were forecasting increasing that deficit. 1 previously in deficit was forecasting moving from deficit into surplus. And then there are 7 schools who were previously in surplus who were forecasting they'll be in a deficit by the end of this financial year. So we'll report, it'll be the June meeting when we report on the actual outturns. But I think important to note that as well as seeing schools moving into deficit, we're also seeing surplus balances reducing, which I mean, in part is the point of having a balance control mechanism, because we want schools to be spending the money that they've got on the children that it's allocated for. But also for some schools, that's becoming an increasingly sort of challenging position as those surpluses are reducing, and the money that they've got to potentially balance the following year's budget is reducing. Those total forecast imbalances for maintained schools are now at 6.2 million. So that was 12.9 million at the end of 24-25. It was 22 million 3 or 4 years ago. So it's come down considerably to a level, and that's potentially that becomes so there are some local authorities who are already moving towards that position where the deficits are higher than the surpluses, where that's so our current sort of netted off position is that forecast of 6.2 million, but that's a kind of potentially challenging position moving forward around that.
Thanks, Kim. Forecasted balances, balance control mechanism. Any question, comment from anyone? No. I'm maybe the fly in the ointment is my job today. I don't know. 6 or 7 years ago, I was probably sitting around this table in a different room, asking questions, challenging questions about our send strategy, because we were in a very difficult situation at a time, and I think all we saw was the barrel of something unpleasant. Fast forward a few years, we've got a wonderful AD of Send and Inclusion who's come up with a very robust strategy and is in the process of rolling that strategy out. And I think there are projections to say that we're going to bring that under control. Maybe my job sitting around the table today, or my opinion sitting around the table today, is to point this out, and that this is very worrying. And I'm wondering if we have Because I think we were 7 or 8 years ago, we were talking about other local authorities in this position and how we were through strategy actually in a very different place. But through lag, through nobody's faults, I think, decreasing numbers, increasing send, lowering budgets, fewer pupils, we're in trouble. And I'm wondering, I'm not advocating at all personally and professionally that we should be shutting down schools, but is that a strategy that we are considering? Are there other strategies that we're putting in place now that we're seeing decreasing surpluses, increasing number of schools in deficit, increasing send with no increasing funding? Like, there are schools in areas that are racking up huge deficits where the surrounding schools are also going into deficit, largely based on pupil number. But if those pupils were distributed to the local schools, those schools' budgets would increase, that school's pressure on the system would decrease. I guess, are there strategies that we're putting in place to avoid what's looking like a real landslide?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So in short, yes. So as I mentioned previously, we have a working group where we discuss some of the challenges, individual schools and groups of schools and areas of the borough where pupil numbers are a challenge. So the implications for those schools and some of the measures that might be taken both at a local authority decision-making level by schools who are their own admissions authorities who would be making decisions, so academy trusts, and the work that school to school kind of peer working in a more direct approach through federations might bring in terms of sustainability. So I think there's been some really significant progress in some of those areas, but there's still a lot of work to do. So in Ealing, up until quite recently, we didn't have any federations, and now we have a number of either formal or on the road to becoming formal federated arrangements. And there is a significant appetite across a number of schools to continue to grow a federated model and arrangements, which brings a resilience that an individual school won't be able to attain in this current climate. We are and always monitor schools and seek to identify schools that may be at potential risk of closure. The local authority has no plans for closure. However, if the combination of factors were present that would require a consultation, that would be a step that we would be required to take under our duties around our sufficiency planning. That's not a direct matter for Forum, but what would be a consideration for Forum would be arrangements around the contingency, any arrangements around the funding for a deficit at the point of a potential closure or amalgamation. And any of those decisions would be brought back to Forum as part of those decision-making arrangements with sufficient information for Forum to consider. But the space where this is discussed in detail and reported publicly, so the school planning and organisation working groups the meeting details are published on Ealing Grid for Learning, so that's available for all schools to see, and there's dissemination through the quadrant groups. And then we report our school place planning arrangements through Cabinet annually, so that's published externally as well. So there is a level of increasing transparency and partnership working, and approaches both at kind of a soft relational level and more crunchy decisions, but we're not yet at the position in Ealing where we're directly planning foreclosure, but it's something that many boroughs across London have either moved towards already, particularly in central London, but will need to consider and monitor in the outer London boroughs.
Thanks, Tamara. And I mean, to be really clear, I mean, I'm hugely supportive and grateful for the financial acumen and strategy work that's taken place in Ealing over many years to keep us where we are now. That's for certain. And I'm a massive supporter of the partnership work that Ealing, through the learning partnership, but also through other mechanisms like federation or partnership working. I'm a huge supporter of the impact that that's having on schools' finances and strategy. I just think that this is something, because you're right, this isn't necessarily a specific conversation for Forum, but Forum is asked to make approvals of a range of funding arrangements that are all indirectly or directly impacted by these kind of factors. So I think it is something that we just need to keep our eye on as a group, because this is scary reading. It's scary reading. Any other comment, question from anyone? Okay. Was there one last? We're at the end. Whoa.
Well done.
Well, then that does, if there are no further comments or questions, that does take us to the end of the January Schools Forum meeting. Thank you, everyone, as always, for your contributions. It's a late evening for many of us who, are in schools or in officer positions all day, and here we are at 7:30 at night discussing finance. So thank you so much for all of your contributions, and we will see you at the next meeting, which is on. Sean.
April.
The April meeting. We will see you at the April meeting of the Schools Forum. Thank you and have an absolutely lovely evening.